The day Amos Slater finally stopped searching was the same day he found her, though he did not know it yet when he rode into the dusty little town of Calverton, Texas, on a sweltering August afternoon in 1882 with nothing left in his saddlebag but a worn photograph, a handful of coins, and a heart that had been beating on pure stubbornness for 10 long years. He had been 22 years old the last time he saw Hester Langston. She had been 19, standing at the edge of her father's property in Laredo with the wind pulling at her dark hair and tears running down her face that she refused to let fall properly, blinking them back with a defiance that had always been her most defining quality. He had been called away, not by choice, not by wanderlust, but by the terrible machinery of circumstance that the frontier seemed to manufacture with careless efficiency. His younger brother Cal had gotten himself into trouble with a cattle outfit up near San Antonio, the kind of trouble that involved debts and men who collected debts with their fists first and their guns second, and Amos had ridden north promising Hester he would be back within the month. He had not come back within the month. A fever hit him outside of Austin. A real killing fever, the kind that stripped a man down to nothing but sweat and delirium for 3 weeks, and when he finally came back to himself in a stranger's barn with a kind old Mexican woman pressing wet cloth to his forehead, it was already October. He had written to Hester. He had written to her father's address in Laredo. He had written twice, 3 times, 5 times over the following months as he sorted out Cal's trouble, which turned out to be far more complicated and far more dangerous than a simple debt, involving stolen cattle, a corrupt county sheriff, and a man named Devlin Cord who had his fingers in half the ranching operations in central Texas. Not one letter had found its way back to him. Not one reply had come. When he finally made it back to Laredo in the spring of 1873, more than 7 months after he had left, Hester was gone. Her father was gone. The house stood empty with its shutters hanging crooked, and the neighbor woman, old Mrs. Prout, told him through her screen door that Thomas Langston had packed his daughter up in the middle of winter and moved on. She did not know where. She thought she had heard someone mention a place called Millbrook or Millfield or some such name, but she was not certain, and besides, she said with a meaningful look that was meant to convey everything proper language could not, Mr. Langston had not seemed pleased with the situation his daughter had found herself in. Amos had stood on that porch in the spring heat and understood, with a sick dropping sensation in his chest, that Thomas Langston had decided he had abandoned Hester. That the letters had never arrived or had been intercepted or had been dismissed as insufficient, he never knew exactly which, but the conclusion had been drawn and acted upon, and Hester had been carried away somewhere without so much as a forwarding address. He spent the next 10 years looking for her. This is not a simple sentence, and it should not be read as one. 10 years in the West in the 1870s and early 1880s meant something entirely different than 10 years anywhere else. It meant seasons of drought and seasons of flood. It meant towns that sprang up around a railroad depot and vanished just as quickly when the line moved. It meant asking questions of bartenders and general store proprietors, and traveling preachers and cattle drovers, describing a dark-haired woman with gray eyes the color of still water, and a habit of pressing her lips together when she was thinking hard about something. It meant following thin trails of rumor that led nowhere, or that led somewhere only to find the wrong woman entirely, some stranger who looked vaguely similar in poor light. He found himself in Abilene, Kansas in 1874 because someone told him a woman named Langston was working as a schoolteacher there. She was 50 years old and taught with a wooden ruler she used more as a weapon than a pointer. He found himself in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1876 because a wagon master swore he had driven a Thomas Langston and his daughter across the territory 2 years prior, heading west. But the trail went cold in the desert, and Amos spent 3 months in Santa Fe doing odd carpentry jobs and asking questions before he accepted that this particular thread had frayed to nothing. He did not stop living his life entirely during those 10 years. A man cannot. He worked cattle drives. He did some scouting for the army during the worst of the Comanche Wars in West Texas, work that he was not proud of looking back, because he had seen enough by then to understand that the people being pushed off their land were not the savages the newspapers made them out to be. He tried ranching on his own for a while outside Wichita Falls and lost the property in a bad year. He was not reckless with money or with himself. He was simply a man walking through his own life, with the persistent feeling that one particular door had been left open and unresolved behind him, flapping in a wind he could not ignore. He kept the photograph in the inside pocket of whatever coat he was wearing, a small daguerreotype that Hester had pressed into his hand the morning he left Laredo, her thumb smudging the edge of it before she let go. Over the years the image had faded at the corners, but her face remained clear enough in the center, that strong jaw, those steady eyes, the suggestion of a smile that was not quite a smile, but something more complicated and more honest than a simple smile could have been. Cal, his brother, had settled down outside of San Marcos with a wife named Dolers and 3 children and a modest cattle operation, and every time Amos visited, which was not often enough, Cal would watch him with worried eyes and say things like, "Brother, you have to let it go. And she has probably built herself a good life somewhere. And you cannot ride every road in Texas looking for one woman." Amos would nod and agree and ride out the next morning and keep looking. He was 32 years old when he rode into Calverton, Texas, in August of 1882, and he had the particular quality that years of outdoor work and solitary living give a man lean and weathered, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a quietness about him that was not coldness, but rather the stillness of someone who had learned to listen more than he spoke. His horse was a good bay gelding named Parrish, 15 hands, steady-tempered, and the two of them had covered enough ground together that they moved like a single thing. Calverton was not a large town. It sat in the hill country of central Texas, between San Antonio to the south and Austin to the north, in a fold of land along a small creek that ran clear most of the year. There was a main street with the usual arrangement of buildings, a general store, a livery, a hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a saloon called the 3 Crowns, a church of whitewashed board, and a doctor's office, a sheriff's office with a real deputy who wore his badge with evident pride. Scattered around the edges of town were houses and small farms, and beyond those the ranches that formed the economic backbone of the place. Amos had come to Calverton because of nothing more specific than geography. He had been working his way back toward Laredo for no particular reason other than that he had not been there in several years, and Calverton was simply the town that appeared when Parrish needed water and his own stomach told him he had not eaten anything substantial since the previous morning. He had no expectation of finding anything in Calverton that he had not found in the 100 other towns he had passed through over the decade. He tied Parrish at the livery, paid for a night's stall and feed, and walked to the hotel to arrange a room. The woman at the desk, a broad, cheerful person named Mrs. Garfield, who appeared to run both the hotel and an impressive quantity of the town's social information, handed him a key and told him supper was at 6 and that he was welcome to wash up at the pump around back. He washed up. He went to the dining room. He sat down at the long communal table with 4 other travelers and 2 permanent boarders, and he ate the best beef stew he had consumed in months and a quantity of cornbread that began to make him feel genuinely human again. He was on his 2nd cup of coffee when the door from the kitchen opened, and the woman who had apparently been doing the cooking came in to ask if anyone needed anything else. He did not recognize her immediately. That sounds like a terrible thing to say about a woman he had spent 10 years searching for, but understand what those 10 years had done. His memory of Hester was preserved in a photograph, and in the amber of longing, fixed at 19 years old, dark-haired and bright-eyed at the edge of her father's yard. The woman standing in the doorway of Mrs. Garfield's dining room was 29 years old, with the same dark hair now pinned practically at the back of her head, the same strong jaw, the same gray eyes, but she had grown into herself in ways that the girl in the photograph had only promised. There was a capability about her, a sureness in how she stood and how she looked around the room with a quick, assessing gaze. It was her habit. She pressed her lips together in that particular way when she was scanning the table to assess who needed more coffee, and it hit Amos like a flat board across the chest. He actually put his cup down with a small sound that was not quite a word. She looked at him when he made the sound. Their eyes met across the table and across 10 years, and Hester Langston went absolutely still. For a moment neither of them spoke. The other people at the table continued eating with the blessed obliviousness of strangers. One of the permanent boarders was saying something about a fence dispute. One of the travelers was asking about the road to Austin. The world continued doing all its ordinary things. "Hester," Amos said, and his voice came out lower and rougher than he intended, stripped down to something essential. She gripped the doorframe with one hand. Just for a second, just long enough for him to see her knuckles whiten, and then she let go of it and straightened her spine with that old familiar defiance. "Amos Slater," she said, and the way she said his name contained approximately 10 years' worth of complicated feeling compressed into 5 syllables. He stood up from the table. He was not entirely sure what he intended to do. He had imagined this moment in a dozen different ways over the years, had rehearsed speeches and explanations and apologies until they went thin with repetition. But what he actually did was simply stand there and look at her, because she was real and present and 3 feet away from him, and after 10 years that was simply staggering. "I have been looking for you," he said. "Since March of 1873 I have been looking for you." Something moved across her face that he could not name. "You had best come out to the kitchen," she said. He followed her through the door into a large kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and biscuits, and she closed the door behind them and turned to face him with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes doing something complicated that he recognized as her attempting to hold several very strong emotions in check simultaneously. "Calverton," he said, somewhat stupidly. "Calverton," she confirmed. "You have been in Calverton." "For 8 years," she said. "My father brought us here from Waco in 1874. He died 2 years ago. I have been working here for Mrs. Garfield since last spring." She paused. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Because I have been to Abilene," he said. "I have been to Santa Fe. I rode through every county in East Texas in 1875 asking after a Thomas Langston and his daughter. I was in El Paso in 1879 because a freighter told me he had seen a woman matching your description running a boarding house there." He stopped, because the list could go on indefinitely, and standing in Mrs. Garfield's kitchen, reciting a decade of failed searches, was not exactly what he had pictured when he imagined finally finding her. Her expression had shifted. Something softer was working its way into it around the edges of the careful composure. "El Paso," she said quietly. "El Paso," he confirmed. She uncrossed her arms. "Amos, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." "All right." "When you did not come back," she said, "I waited. I waited until December, which was longer than my father thought I should. He believed he had decided that you had chosen not to return, that you had gone north and found something or someone more interesting and had simply not bothered. He was not cruel about it. He was protecting me the way he understood how to protect me, which was by moving us somewhere else and not leaving an address." She looked at him steadily. "I did not think he was right. But I was 19 years old and my father was not the kind of man whose decisions were open for discussion, and when he said we were leaving, we left. I wrote to you," Amos said. "I wrote 5 letters. I never received them. I know." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that felt inadequate to the magnitude of the moment. "I had a fever, a bad one outside of Austin. I was in someone's barn for 3 weeks before I could even sit up straight." And then Cal's situation was more tangled than I knew, and by the time I got back to Laredo, it was spring and you were gone." She was quiet for a moment. In the dining room on the other side of the door, someone laughed at something, a bright, ordinary sound. "You should have come back sooner," she said, but there was no real accusation in it, just honesty, which had always been her way. "Yes," he agreed, "I should have. And I should have fought harder to stay." She looked down at the floor, then back up at him. "My father was wrong about you. I always believed that. But believing it and acting on it were two different things, and by the time I was old enough and free enough to act on it, I did not know where to begin looking for a man who had been gone for years with no trail." He took a step toward her. "Hester." "Do not," she said, putting up one hand, "say whatever it is you are about to say just yet. I need a minute to look at you and understand that you are actually standing in my kitchen. It is not exactly your kitchen." "No," she said, and something flickered at the corner of her mouth. "I suppose it is Mrs. Garfield's kitchen, but I run it, which gives me reasonable jurisdiction." That small, almost smile undid him more completely than anything else could have, because it was exactly the same. Exactly. The humor arriving sideways, tucked into the corner of her expression like something she had not entirely intended to let out. "Can I come back tomorrow?" he asked. "And the day after that? I would like a chance to talk to you properly if you are willing." She studied him for what felt like a long time. "I am willing," she said at last. "But Amos, I need you to understand something. I'm not the girl who stood in her father's yard waiting for you to come back. 10 years is a long time. I have built a life here, a small one but mine, and I am not going to throw it sideways for a conversation and a handsome face." "I would not ask you to," he said. "I just want to know you again." There was something almost like pain in her expression then, the good kind of pain that comes from wanting something you had given up hoping for. She nodded once. "Tomorrow then," she said. "I finish here at noon. There is a bench by the creek at the end of Birch Street. I sometimes go there to sit when the weather is decent." "I will be there," he said. He went back to his room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed for what must have been an hour before he actually lay down, and when he finally fell asleep, he slept more soundly than he had in years, as if some fundamental tension in his body had finally been permitted to release. He was at the bench by the creek a full half-hour early. Calverton looked different in the morning light, sharper and more particular than it had the evening before. He noticed things he had not registered on his way in. The well-kept flower boxes on the general store's front windows, the small library that had been established in what looked like a converted freight office, the schoolhouse at the north end of town with its bell tower. He noticed that the streets were reasonably clean, and that the people who moved along them seemed to know each other, pausing to speak, children running between adults' legs with the confidence of a community that watched out for its own. A man named Gideon Holt, who turned out to be the town's blacksmith, introduced himself with a firm handshake and the open curiosity of a small-town man sizing up a stranger. "You passing through or staying?" Gideon asked pleasantly. "I'm not entirely sure yet," Amos said honestly. Gideon nodded as if this were a perfectly satisfactory answer. He was a large man with powerful arms and a pleasant, square face, probably 35 or so, with the slightly watchful quality of someone who had appointed himself informally responsible for the well-being of his community. "You were at Mrs. Garfield's last night," Gideon said. It was not quite a question. "I was." "Good woman, Mrs. Garfield. Good cook working for her too this last year." He said it with a particular mildness that told Amos he knew perfectly well who Amos had spoken to in the kitchen the previous evening, because in a town this size, that sort of information moved like water through cracks. "Miss Langston," Amos said. "Yes," Gideon said, still pleasantly. "She is well thought of here. Does the cooking for Mrs. Garfield and helps the doctor's wife organize the church charity work. Good woman herself." Amos recognized a protective speech when he heard one, even a mild one, and he respected it. "She is," he agreed. "I have known her since she was a girl. We were acquainted in Laredo before her family moved away." Gideon looked at him steadily for a moment. "Laredo?" he repeated. A good while back. Yes. Well, Gideon said, and seemed to have satisfied himself with whatever he had concluded. Welcome to Calverton, Mr. Slater. Amos Slater. Mr. Slater. If you need any work done on your horse, the livery is good, but I handle the more particular shoeing jobs. He offered this information with the easy generosity of a man who was, at his core, decent, and he walked back to his forge. Amos sat on the bench by the creek and watched a red-tailed hawk circle over the hill to the east, and at 10 minutes past noon, he heard footsteps on the path and turned around. She had changed out of the work apron she had been wearing the night before. She was wearing a blue dress the color of a cloudy sky, and her hair was still pinned up but more loosely, as if she had taken some care with it without wanting to appear to have taken some care with it, which Amos found enormously endearing. She was carrying a small basket with what turned out to be 2 pieces of cornbread wrapped in a cloth, because she had determined that they might as well eat while they talked. She sat down on the other end of the bench, which was not a very long bench, and handed him a piece of cornbread. You were early, she said. How do you know? Because Mrs. Garfield's room at the front of the hotel looks straight down Birch Street, she said. I was not watching for you particularly. Mrs. Garfield may have been. Mrs. Garfield seems very well informed about her boarders. Mrs. Garfield is very well informed about everything, Hester said. She means well by it. She is not unkind. She looked at the creek where the water ran shallow over a bed of pale, flat stones. Tell me where you have been, she said. Tell me all of it. I want to know. So he told her. He told her about the fever and the barn, and the kind woman who had nursed him. He told her about the months sorting out Cal's trouble, about the cattle thieves and the corrupt sheriff, and the eventual resolution of the whole tangled business, which had involved the intervention of a Texas ranger named Beaumont, who took the matter seriously once it was properly explained to him. He told her about coming back to Laredo and finding the house empty, about Mrs. Prout and her careful, damning little speech. He told her about the years of searching, not every detail, not every false lead, but the shape of it, the sustained determination of it, and she listened with the focused attention she had always given to things that mattered to her, eating her cornbread and watching the creek. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Abilene, she said. Santa Fe. El Paso. She said them like she was measuring distances she had not known to think about. Amos, in 1876 we were in Waco. My father worked for a hardware merchant named Pulliam. We were there for 3 years before we came here. I was never in Waco, he said. No, she said softly. You were in Santa Fe. The sheer geographic unfairness of it settled between them for a moment, the years and the miles and all the near misses of a continent-sized game of misdirection. Tell me about the last 10 years, he said. Your years, she told him. Her voice was even and clear, and she spoke the way she had always spoken, directly, without ornamentation, but with a precision that made everything she said feel vivid. She told him about leaving Laredo in December and the bitter cold of that winter journey, about arriving in Waco and finding it larger and louder than she had expected. She told him about learning to cook properly, not as a domestic accomplishment but as a genuine skill, because her father's income from the hardware merchant was not generous, and she had taken it upon herself to make their table as good as possible on modest means. She told him about her father, not unkindly, but honestly. Thomas Langston had been a proud man who loved his daughter in the difficult way of proud men who do not quite know how to say so. He had worked hard in Waco and then in Calverton, where a cousin had offered him a partnership in a small dry goods operation. He had spent his last years in reasonable contentment, she said, and when he died in 1880, the consumption took him relatively quickly, which was its one mercy. She had buried him in Calverton's churchyard, and she visited the grave on Sundays. Were you happy? Amos asked. She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she considered things. I was not unhappy, she said. There is a difference. I found satisfactions. I made good friends here. Mrs. Garfield is a friend as much as an employer, truly, whatever the arrangement looks like from outside. The doctor, Dr. Purcell, and his wife Nora have been kind to me. I built something, but no, she paused. I was not entirely happy. There was always a thing unfinished. He turned to look at her properly, not checking himself for politeness the way he had been since she sat down, just looking. I want to court you, he said, properly, if you will let me. She met his gaze, and there was a kind of reckoning in it, the way a person looks when they are deciding whether to trust something that has cost them before. You are 32 years old, Amos Slater, and you have no settled occupation and no home. True on all 3 points. You would have to stay in Calverton long enough to be taken seriously. You cannot court a woman and then ride out again when the mood takes you. I am not planning to ride out, he said. I spent 10 years trying to get to wherever you were. I am not anxious to start riding anywhere again. Something in her eased slightly. Not the whole fortress, not all at once, but a gate opened. There is a carpentry operation here, she said carefully. Old Mr. Featherstone does furniture and repair work, but he is getting old and his joints trouble him. He has said more than once that he could use someone younger. He built that bench you are sitting on, actually. It is a good bench, Amos said. You do carpentry, she said. It was not a question. She was remembering. I have done carpentry, he said, among other things, but I am better at it than I am at most other things. She folded the cloth that had held the cornbread and set it in her basket and stood up. Come back tomorrow, she said, and the day after, and we will see. He came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. Old Mr. Featherstone, who turned out to be a small, sparrow-like man of 70 with magnificently swollen knuckles and a suspicious squint that softened the moment Amos demonstrated he knew which end of a plane to use, took him on as a junior partner within the week. It was not a grand arrangement. A modest shop on the far side of the blacksmith's, a workbench and a collection of tools, orders for chairs and tables and window frames, but it was honest work, and it suited Amos in the way that work with his hands always had. He saw Hester most days, though not always in the planned, formal way of courtship. He ate breakfast at Mrs. Garfield's hotel because it was where he was boarding, and she served the breakfast, and they had developed a comfortable habit of exchanging a few words in those morning hours that meant nothing individually and everything collectively. He learned that she read voraciously and had developed an arrangement with the small library to borrow books, which she got through at a pace that impressed the librarian, a methodical woman named Mrs. Crane. He learned that she had a temper, not a sharp one but a slow, deep one that ignited when she saw something genuinely unjust, like the time she spoke up at a town meeting about the way the Mexican families who lived on the south edge of Calverton were being taxed on their properties at a different rate than the Anglo families. A speech that caused a significant, uncomfortable silence before Sheriff Broderick, a fair-minded man, acknowledged she had a point and said the matter would be investigated. He learned that she liked the evenings best, when the heat broke and the light went golden and the whole hill country looked like something in a painting. He learned that she made 3 kinds of pie, peach being the best, and that she was teaching herself rudimentary Spanish from a battered dictionary she had found in the library's collection. She learned him too. She watched him work. She stopped at Featherstone's shop one morning with a delivery that had no real reason to be delivered by her specifically, which he recognized for what it was but did not comment on, and she watched the care he brought to the work, the patience of it, the way he ran his hand along a piece of wood to feel where it wanted to be shaped. She sat with him on the creek bench on Sunday afternoons, which had become their established habit, and she asked him questions about the years and listened carefully to the answers. One Sunday, about 3 weeks after his arrival, she said something that surprised him. "I want to apologize," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For being so careful with you." She was looking at the creek, not at him. "I know why I am doing it. It is because the last time I trusted that you would come back, you did not. And I know that is not fair, I know now. In a way I only half believed then that you had reasons, and that the fault was in the circumstances and not in you. but I have been treating you like a risk assessment rather than a person I was genuinely glad to see." The honesty of it, direct and undefended, was so characteristic of her that he felt the familiar compression in his chest that he associated with everything Hester Langston had ever made him feel. "You are right to be careful," he said. "I would not have it any other way." "No," she said, and now she turned to look at him. "I would have it differently. I want to stop being careful, Amos." He reached out and covered her hand with his where it rested on the bench between them, and she looked down at his hand on hers, and then she turned her hand over so their palms were together and her fingers closed around his. It was a small thing. After 10 years, it was the smallest possible physical gesture, but it was a declaration as clear as anything spoken, and they both knew it. They sat like that for a long time, watching the creek run over its pale stones, and the red-tailed hawk that had been circling on the first morning was there again, riding a thermal up over the eastern hill, and the afternoon light went from gold to amber and the air cooled, and neither of them felt any particular urgency to say anything at all, because the silence was comfortable and full of its own meaning. He kissed her for the first time 2 weeks after that, on a Tuesday evening when he had walked her back from a church social that she had attended as part of her charity work, and he had attended because she would be there. They were standing at the door of Mrs. Garfield's hotel, and the night was warm and thick with the smell of cedar and the distant sound of someone's fiddle from the direction of the Three Crowns Saloon, and she looked up at him in the lamplight with her gray eyes clear and steady. He said, "Hester, may I?" "Yes," she said before he finished. So he kissed her, and it was not tentative. He had waited 10 years, and she had waited 10 years, and the kiss knew that, was shaped by it, was warm and serious and thorough, in the way of something that had been deferred too long to be anything but exactly what it was. When they separated, she kept her eyes closed for a moment and then opened them and looked at him, and the expression on her face was not complicated at all for once, it was simply joyful. "I have wanted to do that since you were 19 years old," he said. "You did it when I was 19, she said. "Once, at the Hartley Barn dance, you were very proper about it." "I am less inclined toward propriety at 32, he said. "Good," she said, and went inside. He stood on the porch for a moment in the warm dark, listening to the fiddle, and felt something in his chest that he identified with some amazement as plain, uncomplicated happiness, which was not an emotion he had spent a great deal of time with lately. The weeks settled into an ease that neither of them entirely trusted at first, because easy things had not been their experience with each other, but which gradually proved itself to be genuine. He worked at Featherstone's through the mornings and sometimes the afternoons. She managed Mrs. Garfield's kitchen and her other community obligations. They had Sunday afternoons at the creek and Tuesday and Thursday evenings that began to involve walking, conversation, meals at the hotel table in the comfortable companionability of two people who had known each other long enough to not need to perform. Gideon Holt, the blacksmith, stopped being watchful and became something like a friend. He and his wife Ellen had Amos and Hester to supper one Friday, and the evening was so easy and pleasant, the four of them around a table with Ellen's good chicken and cold buttermilk, and a conversation that ranged from the price of lumber to the current reading of the Texas Constitution to Gideon's opinion that his youngest son had the makings of a fine horseman, that Amos walked home feeling he had been given something he had not known to specifically want: community. The particular warmth of belonging to a place. "You like it here," Hester said the next Sunday. She said it as an observation with a small note of wonder in it. "I do," he said. "Do you?" "I have liked it for a while," she said, "but it is different now," she considered. "It feels more like mine now. Before you came it was good but slightly borrowed, like I was living in a place that was very kind to me without being entirely certain it was my place." He understood that. He had felt it for years, the quality of passing through rather than belonging to. "Hester," he said carefully, because there was something he had been moving toward for weeks and he was going to say it now, "I would like to ask your father's permission for something, except that your father is not here to ask." She looked at him with perfect composure. "No," she said, "he is not. So I am asking you directly. That seems appropriate. Will you marry me?" The composure cracked. Not badly, not in a way that looked like anything other than genuine feeling surfacing. Her eyes went bright and she pressed her lips together in that particular way, but this time the emotion behind it was entirely transparent. "Amos Slater," she said, "you have been in Calverton for 6 weeks. I have known you for 13 years, he said. I spent 10 of them looking for you. I believe I have done an adequate period of consideration." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh properly, fully, unself-consciously since he had arrived, and it was exactly as he remembered it, warm and unguarded. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. Did you think I was going to say anything else?" "I was not certain," he said. "You are a careful woman." "I was," she said. "I have decided to stop being careful. I told you so 3 weeks ago." She reached up and straightened the collar of his shirt with a brisk, proprietary gesture that was more intimate than it appeared. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in the church at Calverton on a Saturday in October of 1882, with the hill country in its autumn color, outside the whitewashed windows and the whole town apparently in attendance. Because news of their story, the 10 years, the searching, the way he had walked into Mrs. Garfield's hotel and found her across a dinner table, had circulated through Calverton with the thoroughness that small towns bring to truly satisfying stories. Mrs. Garfield wept openly and without embarrassment. Gideon Holt served as Amos's witness with an expression of great satisfaction, as if he had personally arranged the whole thing. Ellen Holt had helped Hester alter a dress of blue silk, darker than the blue she had worn on their first real conversation by the creek, and Hester wore it with her hair down. For the first time Amos had seen it loose in all the years he had known her, and it undid him entirely in the best possible way. Dr. Purcell's wife Nora, who had been one of Hester's closest friends through the Calverton years, held Hester's hands before the ceremony in the small side room and told her she was glowing, which Hester dismissed as sentimental but which was also objectively true. The Reverend, a serious young man named Mr. Albright, who had only been in Calverton for a year himself, performed the ceremony with evident feeling, as if he had been briefed on the circumstances and understood he was participating in something that deserved more than routine solemnity. When he said the words that bound them, Amos and Hester said their vows looking directly at each other, and everyone in the church who had eyes to see understood what was behind those 4 quiet words from Hester. "I will," she said, and she meant years of patience and years of choosing to believe, and the willingness to open the gate again when she had reasonable cause to keep it shut. "I will," Amos said, and he meant the decade of roads in the photograph worn soft at the corners, and the absolute refusal to accept that she was simply lost. There was a supper afterward in the church hall, organized by Mrs. Garfield with characteristic competence. There was dancing, the fiddle and a guitar, the kind of dancing that small western towns did well, communal and cheerful and completely unconcerned with propriety. Amos danced with his wife, which was a sentence he took a moment to appreciate as he was dancing it. His wife, Hester Slater, warm in his arms in the October evening. Cal rode up from San Marcos for the wedding, with Dolers and their 3 children, 8-year-old Robert, 5-year-old Maria, and 2-year-old James, and Cal shook Amos's hand outside the church afterward with a grip that was almost painful and eyes that were slightly too bright. "I told you," Cal said. "You told me to give up," Amos said. "Yes," Cal admitted, "and I was wrong. I am glad I was wrong." He pulled Amos into an embrace that was brief but fierce. "You look like a man who has put down something very heavy." "I feel like one," Amos said. Dolers embraced Hester and told her in both Spanish and English that she was delighted, and Hester, whose developing Spanish was enough to follow the sentiment, responded in careful, imperfect Spanish that made Dolers light up with genuine pleasure. They settled into the house Amos had been renting since his 2nd week in Calverton, a modest two-room structure on the north side of town that he had spent his spare hours making decent. He had built a proper kitchen table and 2 solid chairs, and a bed frame that would outlast both of them. He had repaired the porch and replaced 2 windows and plastered the interior walls, and by the time Hester moved her small collection of belongings into it, the house had a quality of being cared for that made it feel like a home before either of them had quite moved in. Hester's belongings were modest: her books, her cooking tools, a small painting that had been her mother's, the blue dictionary she was learning Spanish from. But she had a capacity for making a space hers that expressed itself immediately in small particular ways. A bunch of dried wildflowers on the table, the books arranged in a specific order on the shelf Amos had built for them, the cooking tools hung in a system that made immediate logical sense. They were happy. This also deserves not to be read as a simple sentence. They were happy in the way of 2 people who had been unhappy in a specific way for a long time and knew what the difference felt like. They argued sometimes because they were both people of strong opinion. Hester was more immediately verbal about it. Amos went quiet in a way that she learned to read and probe back to speech. And they had to learn the architecture of each other's disagreements before they got good at resolving them, which took a few months of adjustment that involved at least 2 evenings where one of them went for a long walk and came back ready to speak plainly. But the arguments were never cruel and never about anything fundamental, because, on the fundamental things, they were simply aligned in a way that felt like the reward for having been so patient for so long. He kept working with old Featherstone, and as the old man's hands got worse through the winter of 1882 and into 1883, Amos took on more of the actual work and Featherstone moved more toward the business side of things, which he turned out to be considerably better at than the carpentry itself. They made a reasonable team. Amos had a talent for the work that went beyond mere skill. He understood wood in an almost intuitive way, could look at a piece of raw lumber and see what it wanted to be, and the pieces he made had a quality of proportion and finish that began to attract orders from San Antonio and even once from Austin. In the spring of 1883, Hester came to find him at the workshop one afternoon with an expression on her face that he did not immediately know how to read, because it was a new one, or rather a combination of things he had seen separately. "I have something to tell you," she said, and then she told him, and his face did something that she said afterward she wished she had been watching from the outside, because she had never seen quite that expression on any human face before. They were going to have a child. He took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her cheeks and then her mouth, and she laughed a little against his lips, and he said something into her hair that was mostly incoherent but which she understood perfectly. The pregnancy was easier than she had heard from other women, though the summer heat was oppressive, and she felt that particularly in July and August, when the temperature sat above 100 degrees for days at a stretch, and the shade was barely relief. Dr. Purcell watched over her with the careful attention of a good physician and the additional layer of personal fondness that came from his wife Nora's close friendship with Hester. He told them in late September that everything was progressing exactly as it should. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a cold, clear night when the stars over the hill country were exceptional. They named him Thomas Cal Slater Thomas for Hester's father, the complicated, proud, difficult man who had loved his daughter in his limited way and whose absence from this moment Hester felt quietly, and Cal for Amos's brother, who would have been insufferably pleased about being a namesake, and who in fact was insufferably pleased when they wrote to San Marcos to tell him. Thomas was a large, pink, vociferous baby who announced his opinions about everything with great conviction from his first hour of existence, which Amos said was entirely inherited from his mother, and Hester said was entirely inherited from his father, and both of them were secretly pleased about either way. Mrs. Garfield came with a basket of food the next morning and stood over the baby's cradle, which Amos had built, a beautiful piece of work in pale ash with smooth rockers, and declared him the finest baby in the hill country, which was not a neutral declaration from Mrs. Garfield, who had seen a considerable number of hill country babies over her years. Cal and Dolers came up from San Marcos the following Sunday, and Cal held the baby with the particular competence of a man who had held 3 of his own, and told Amos quietly in the yard, while the women were inside, that he had never seen his brother look like this, like a man fully arrived in his own life, and Amos said he felt like one. The house, which had been modest when they moved into it, was already beginning to feel tight with a baby in it, and over the winter of 1883 and into 1884, Amos added 2 rooms to it, a proper bedroom, and a second room that could be a nursery or a sitting room or both, which it essentially became, with Thomas's cradle in the corner and Hester's books along one wall and a rocking chair. She particularly liked facing the window that looked east toward the hill. Old Featherstone, whose health declined steadily through 1884, signed over full ownership of the carpentry business to Amos in May of that year, in exchange for a modest pension arrangement that Amos paid with genuine gladness, because the old man had given him something that had turned out to matter more than the business itself, a reason to stay in Calverton long enough to let everything else take root. Featherstone died that November, peacefully in his sleep, and they buried him next to his wife of 40 years in the church cemetery, and the whole town turned out, because he had been a fixture of Calverton for 25 years and had built more of the furniture in more of its homes than anyone had actually counted. Amos renamed the workshop Slater Woodworks and hired a young man named Eddie Rios, who was 20 years old and Mexican-American, and had an aptitude for the work that Amos recognized immediately. Eddie's family lived on the south side of town, in the community that had dealt with the unfair taxation that Hester had raised at the town meeting 2 years prior, a matter that Sheriff Broderick had actually corrected, slowly, and with some resistance from a few of the more entrenched property owners, but corrected nonetheless. Eddie was serious and quick-learning and grateful for the work, and within a year he was producing finished pieces that could hold their own alongside anything Amos made, and Amos told him so plainly, because it was true, and because a young man with talent deserved to know it. In 1885, Hester began a project she had been thinking about since before Thomas was born. Calverton had a schoolhouse and a library, but what it did not have was any organized education for the children on the south side of town, the Mexican-American children whose families worked the smaller farms and the service trades and whose kids had, in the casual way of a frontier town that had not sorted out all its obligations, simply been going without in certain respects. Hester, who had been teaching Thomas his letters with the methodical joy of a woman who genuinely loves the process of learning, organized a Saturday school in the church hall. She taught it herself, with the patient competence that she brought to everything, and within 2 months she had 12 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old who came every Saturday morning and went home with something they had not had before. Amos built the desks. This was the first time he had felt the particular satisfaction of a piece of work that was purely for giving to someone who needed it, and he told Hester so, standing in the church hall surrounded by 12 small desks that fit perfectly. "You have always built things for other people," she said, straightening one of the desks. "You just did not always get to see them used." He thought about that. "You are right," he said. "I usually am," she said, without a trace of smugness, just as a statement of frequency. Thomas turned 2 years old in November of 1885, a bright, opinionated child who had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and an absolute conviction that everything in the world was available for touching and examination. He treated Gideon Holt's massive blacksmith arms as a personal climbing structure when they visited, which Gideon endured with the good humor of a man who found children genuinely delightful. He called Mrs. Garfield, the big lady, in a tone of pure descriptive admiration, and Mrs. Garfield was charmed by it in a way that she would have denied if pressed. On a warm evening in April of 1886, Amos and Hester sat on the porch of their house, the expanded house, with its added rooms and its good tight roof that Amos had built himself, and its flower boxes under the windows that Hester had planted with whatever she could get to grow in the hill country soil, and watched the last light go off the hill to the east. Thomas was inside asleep, having burned through his considerable daily energy at a rate that still amazed both his parents. Hester was sitting in the chair she liked with her feet up on the porch rail, which was not entirely proper but which Amos had never once commented on because he found it endearing. "I was thinking today," she said, "about Mrs. Prout." He looked at her. "The neighbor woman in Laredo," she said, "the one who told you we had gone." "I remember," he said, "thin woman, screen door." "I was thinking," Hester said, "that she told you enough to keep you looking. She said she did not know where we had gone, but she mentioned a name, Millbrook or Millfield or something." "Millfield," he said. "She was not sure about it." "She was not sure about it," Hester agreed. "We never went anywhere called Millfield. She had it from something she had half heard probably, but it was enough of a thread that you kept pulling." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking that I owe that woman something. She never knew she pointed you in any useful direction, and she pointed you in the wrong direction entirely, but she gave you something to chase. If she had said nothing, you might have stopped in Laredo." Amos considered that. The logic of it was characteristic of Hester, who traced the chains of causation in things the way he traced the grain of wood. "I might have," he agreed. "And then we would not be here," she said. The evening had a quality of perfect ordinariness and perfect sufficiency that he had come to recognize as his deepest contentment. The smell of cedar on the evening air, the light going amber on the hill, his wife's profile in the porch light, strong and clear and familiar. Somewhere inside the house, his son sleeping with the complete unconscious trust of a child who has been given every reason to trust. "Hester," he said. "Yes. I want you to know something that I may not say often enough, because I am not always good at saying things." She turned her head to look at him. "Every road I rode for 10 years, he said, "every town, every dead end, I would ride all of it again to end up here. And I know that sounds like the kind of thing a man says, but I mean it in a specific, literal way. I would ride every mile of it again." She looked at him for a long moment. Her gray eyes were steady and serious and full. "I know," she said quietly, "and I want you to know that I am glad you did not stop." She paused. "Even though you were in El Paso while I was in Waco, and Santa Fe while I was in Waco, and everywhere in between while I was 2 towns over," he said, and the absurdity and the tenderness of the actual geography of it was in his voice. "Not even 2 towns," she said. "I was in Calverton for 8 years before you rode in. You were in Texas, I was in Texas." "The state is very large," he said. "It is," she agreed, and the warmth in her voice was unmistakable. "But you found me." "You were in the kitchen," he said. "I was in the kitchen." They sat with that for a while, the particular comedy and particular heartache and particular grace of it. And then Hester put her feet down from the rail and leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. And he turned his head and kissed her back properly, there on the porch in the April evening, with the last gold going off the hill. The second pregnancy came in the summer of 1886, which Hester received with the same composure she brought to everything, and announced to him on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table over coffee with a look on her face that was familiar by now, the combination of certainty and complicated joy. He lifted her out of her chair and held her in the middle of the kitchen, and she laughed and told him to put her down. She was fine. She was just going to have a baby, not take a bullet. "Those 2 things are not as different as you might like," Dr. Purcell said when they went to tell him, in his dry medical way, which Hester appreciated and Amos found only mildly horrifying. This pregnancy was harder than the first. The summer heat bore down with a particular cruelty, and there were 2 months in the middle where Hester was sick enough in the mornings that she had to hand the Saturday school over to one of the older students, a capable 15-year-old named Rosa Rios, who was Eddie's sister, and who turned out to run the class with a firmness that made Hester say she had been unnecessary to the whole enterprise the whole time. Nora Purcell came most mornings during those bad months and sat with Hester and brought her cold cloths and practical company. And Amos did the cooking, which was not his strongest skill, but which he applied to with the same quiet determination he applied to everything. Thomas, 3 years old and entirely unaware that he was about to become a big brother, continued doing 3-year-old things with enormous energy and a vocabulary that was expanding at a rate that gave Amos occasional concern, because an increasing percentage of it seemed to be words he had picked up from the blacksmith's shop. Their daughter was born in February of 1887, a small, fierce creature with black hair and gray eyes that were unmistakably Hester's, who came into the world with the same vocal conviction as her brother, and immediately made clear that she had opinions. They named her Clara Dolors Slater Clara because Hester had loved the name since childhood, and Dolors for Cal's wife, who cried openly when the letter arrived in San Marcos, and who told Cal through her tears that it was the nicest thing anyone had ever done, which Cal disputed on the grounds that he had once given her a horse, but he was pleased too. Thomas was introduced to Clara with the wary fascination of a child who has been told about something and is now evaluating whether the reality matches the description. He looked at her in the cradle for a long time. "She is very small," he said. "She will get bigger," Amos told him. "Like I got bigger, exactly like you." Thomas considered this information and apparently found it satisfactory, because after a moment he went back to his block building without further objection, and from that point on accepted his sister as an established feature of the world, like the creek and the blacksmiths and his father's workshop. The business was doing well enough by 1887 that Amos and Eddie Rios talked seriously about expanding, not just the workshop itself but the operation, taking on a second employee, and reaching more actively for the San Antonio market, where good furniture commanded good prices, and there were enough wealthy ranching families to support a quality craftsman. Eddie had by this time been given a partial ownership stake in the business, a development that Amos had proposed, and that Eddie had accepted with a dignity that made Amos respect him more, not the overwhelmed gratitude of someone who had not expected fair treatment, but the quiet acknowledgement of someone who recognized it as what it was. Eddie's family, the Rios family broadly, had become part of the fabric of the Slaters' life in Calverton. His mother, a woman named Esperanza who was approximately 60, and had the bearing of someone who had seen a great deal of the world's nonsense and was not impressed by most of it, had taken a particular shine to Hester, a mutual appreciation that expressed itself mostly in the exchange of recipes and advice, and the occasional companionable silence over coffee. Rosa Rios, the 15-year-old who had taken over the Saturday school, was now 17 and had expressed a desire to become a teacher properly, and Hester was writing letters on her behalf to people she knew in San Antonio who might know how that could be arranged. Calverton grew through the late 1880s. The railroad extended a spur line to within 12 miles of town in 1888, which brought new families and new commerce and a degree of controversy about what kind of town Calverton wanted to be going forward, a discussion conducted at town meetings that were sometimes loud and always revealing about who people were. Sheriff Broderick retired in 1887, and was replaced by a younger man named Morrison who proved to be less reliably fair. And there were 2 years of difficulty with the South Side community before Morrison either grew into the job or realized the community was more organized and more supported than he had expected, and he adjusted his approach. Hester was involved in that adjustment in ways that were less visible than her original town meeting speech, but more sustained and arguably more effective, working through the church charity committee and through personal relationships to make it very difficult for small injustices to go unwitnessed. Amos, who admired this quality in his wife with a completeness that still surprised him in its intensity, told her once that she was the most useful person in Calverton, and she told him that was not a romantic thing to say, and he told her he thought it was the most romantic thing he knew how to say, and she considered that for a moment and decided he was right. Thomas started proper school in the fall of 1888, 5 years old and armed with a reading ability that put him considerably ahead of most of his class, a consequence of having a mother who had been reading to him since he was old enough to sit up and a father who had narrated his carpentry work to him in comprehensive detail. His teacher, a serious young man named Mr. Dawes who was fresh from a teaching college in Austin, came to the house in the second week of school to ask Hester what she had been feeding the child educationally, because he was disruptive in the best possible way, always 2 steps ahead of the lesson. "Read to them young and read to them often," Hester said. "What else?" Mr. Dawes asked. "Answer their questions honestly. Do not simplify things more than you have to. They understand more than we assume." Mr. Dawes wrote this down as if she had said something profound, which she had, though she had said it as matter of fact. Clara, at a year old, had her own approach to life that was becoming apparent. Where Thomas had been immediately sociable, immediately interested in every person and thing around him, Clara was more selective, more interior, watching everything with those gray eyes from a position of calculation before she committed to engagement. When she decided to engage with something or someone, however, she did so completely and with the full force of her considerable personality, which she apparently got from both sides of her inheritance. She had attached herself to Gideon Holt's daughter Bess, who was 4 years older and who accepted Clara's devotion with the older child magnanimity of someone who has been given a small and extremely devoted follower. In the spring of 1889, Cal wrote from San Marcos with news. He and Dolers were moving to Calverton. The small cattle operation outside San Marcos had been sold at a good price, and they had been thinking for a while about being closer to Amos. Their children were growing up without knowing their uncle and aunt and cousins, Cal wrote, and he thought the hill country suited Dolers, who had family connections in the region. He asked if Amos knew of any suitable land. Amos walked to the land office the next morning and spent 3 hours with the land agent going through what was available, and by noon he had identified 2 potential properties and written back to his brother. Cal and Dolers and their children, Robert, now 15, Maria 12, James 9, arrived in Calverton in August of 1889, in a wagon loaded with their household and the cheerful chaos of a family that had been packing and moving and was ready to be done with both. Robert, who had his father's broad frame and his mother's dark eyes, was immediately useful with the unloading. Maria, who was at the age of precise social assessment, gave both Hester and Amos a careful look before apparently deciding they were acceptable and relaxing into easy affection. James simply ran directly at Thomas, whom he had met twice before and remembered as the best possible playmate, and the 2 of them disappeared into the yard and did not come back until supper. Cal bought the smaller of the 2 properties Amos had identified, a 12-acre parcel with good water and a house that needed work, and Amos spent 2 Saturdays over August and September helping him with the worst of the structural repairs, and Gideon Holt came one Saturday and contributed his considerable strength and practical knowledge, and by October the place was livable and becoming genuinely good. Having Cal in Calverton turned out to be something that Amos had not known to want until he had it: the daily proximity of his brother, the easy comfort of someone who knew his whole history and did not need to be explained to. They had a standing arrangement, the Slater brothers and their families, of Sunday dinner alternating between the 2 houses, which became the fixed point of the week for 6 children who ranged in age from Clara at 2 to Robert at 15. Those Sunday dinners were large and loud, and full of the overlapping conversations of a family that had too much to say it one at a time. Hester and Dolores cooked together with the efficiency of two women who had decided to be friends and had followed through on the decision. And they talked while they cooked in a mixture of English and Spanish that was not quite either language but was perfectly functional. And the children ate everything put in front of them, and the men cleaned the dishes, which Cal had instituted as a rule in his own household and Amos had adopted without objection. And afterward everyone sat on whichever porch had the better evening light, and the children ran until dark. Amos watched all of it sometimes with the quality of a man who is aware of the specific gift of what he is experiencing. He had ridden enough roads and slept in enough empty camps to know the value of this, the table and the children and the voices, and the woman beside him who pressed her shoulder against his and sometimes said things quietly that were only for him in the middle of all the noise. In 1890, Hester's Saturday school became a formal institution. The church board authorized a second building on its property, and the county education office in San Antonio, after some sustained communication from Hester and Dr. Purcell, and two members of the church board who had come around to the necessity, provided modest funding and official recognition. Rosa Rios, now 20, was the head teacher, returned from 6 months in San Antonio where Hester's letters had found traction with the right people, and she had received proper training. The school had 30 students by its first official autumn term. There was a ceremony for the opening that was attended by most of the town and several people from the surrounding county, and Hester gave a short speech that was, in the way of all good speeches, essentially about something larger than its immediate occasion, about who a community decided to include and what the cost of exclusion was, and about what it meant to take the future seriously. It was not a long speech. Hester was not given to long speeches, but it was exact and it was clear, and when she finished, there was a silence of the kind that means people are sitting with something rather than simply waiting to clap. Amos, standing at the back of the gathered crowd because he had arrived slightly late from the workshop, watched his wife stand at the front with the new schoolhouse behind her and the October light on her face, and felt the particular complicated tenderness of a man who knows he is not responsible for what he is looking at but who has been permitted to be near it. After the ceremony, walking home with Thomas on one side and Clara on the other and Hester beside him, he took her hand. "You are remarkable," he said. "I organized a school," she said. "Yes," he said. "You did." She glanced at him sideways. "How much trouble did you have getting here on time? The Hartley order needed." "I knew it," she said, but she was smiling. "I was there for the speech," he said. "That was the important part." "The whole thing was the important part," she said, but she did not let go of his hand. Thomas, 7 years old and approaching the age of very specific opinions, said, "Papa was late because he was making a table," in a tone of informative clarity. "Thank you," Amos told his son. "You are welcome," Thomas said. Clara, 3 years old and deeply invested in the proceedings, had spent the ceremony on Dolores' hip and had apparently absorbed it as an event worthy of repetition, because she announced on the walk home that she was going to have a school too, and that Thomas had to come to it, and that she would teach him things. Thomas said he already knew things, and Clara said she knew more things, and they argued this point companionably for the remaining 3 blocks home. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Amos and Hester sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and the comfortable quiet of the end of a day that had been full and good. "I have been thinking," Hester said. "Tell me." "I have been thinking about the photograph," she said. "The one you carried." He knew the one she meant. It had lived in the inside pocket of his coat for 10 years and had been transferred to a small box on their dresser since the wedding because he no longer needed it in the way he had needed it before. "What about it?" "I want it framed," she said. "Properly framed and hung somewhere in the house." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Not because it is a good photograph. It is not. It has gone soft at the corners and I look about 12 years old in it." "You looked 19, he said. "I look 12, she said firmly. "But I want it in the house because it is the thing you carried. For 10 years you carried that photograph, and it is—" She stopped for a moment. "It is the clearest evidence I have ever been given that someone chose to keep looking when they might have stopped, and I want it where I can see it." He was quiet for a moment. "I will build a frame for it this week," he said. "Something simple," she said. "Nothing fancy." "Oak," he said. "Simple joint, clean finish." "That is exactly right," she said. He built the frame on Wednesday, a neat rectangle of pale oak with clean square corners and a smooth finish, and on Thursday evening he hung it on the wall of their sitting room between the window and the bookshelf, where the light from the lamp reached it in the evenings. The photograph sat inside it, small and slightly faded, a young woman standing at the edge of a yard with the wind in her hair and a complicated expression that was not quite a smile. Hester stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she stepped back and stood against his shoulder. "There," she said. "There," he agreed. In the spring of 1891, Amos was offered a contract by a furniture merchant in San Antonio for the largest order Slater Woodworks had ever received. A set of dining furniture for a hotel that was being built in the city. Tables and chairs and sideboards, 60 pieces in total, to be delivered by the end of the year. He sat at the kitchen table with the figures for 2 evenings before he brought Hester into the conversation, not because he did not want her opinion, but because he wanted to think it through first. She listened to all of it, asked 3 precise questions about the financing and the timeline and the capacity of the workshop, and then said, "You can do this." "We would need another man," he said, "maybe 2. Eddie has 2 cousins who have been looking for work," she said. "He mentioned it in passing to me last month. Good workers," he said. Amos looked at her. "You have been thinking about this." "I saw the merchant's letter when it arrived," she said mildly. "You leave things on the kitchen table." He accepted the contract. He hired Eddie's cousins, Miguel and Samuel Rios, who were in fact excellent workers, and the workshop expanded into the adjacent building that had been a storage space, and was converted through a month of very busy carpentry into a proper second workshop floor. The 60 pieces were delivered to San Antonio in November of 1891, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and to the significant satisfaction of the hotel's owners, which led to 2 further orders before the year was out. Slater Woodworks had become, without Amos quite intending it, a real business, one that employed 7 people by the end of 1892 and had a reputation in Central Texas for quality that brought in work steadily. He had not set out to build an enterprise. He had set out to have a reason to stay in one place, but the enterprise had grown from the work in the natural way of things that are done well, and he found that he did not mind it. He was 42 years old in 1892, and still lean, still weathered, still with the habit of listening more than he spoke. But the lines at his eyes were from something better now than squinting into the search horizon. They were from years of looking at things that were worth looking at. Thomas was 9 years old and had developed a passion for horses that expressed itself practically in his relationship with the livery owner, a patient man named Peters who allowed Thomas to help with the horses after school in exchange for mucking stalls, an arrangement that Thomas considered entirely fair and his parents considered entirely educational. He was also reading at a level that Mr. Dawes said he had not encountered in a 9-year-old, and while he still argued with Clara about who knew more things, the argument had taken on a quality of affectionate habit rather than genuine competition. Clara was 5 years old and in Rosa Rios's school, where she was already the most opinionated student in the room, a distinction Rosa mentioned to Hester with a combination of pride and mild despair. "She gets it from you," Amos told Hester. "She gets the opinions from me," Hester agreed. "She gets the volume from you. I am a quiet man. You are a quiet man when you agree with things," she said. "You are not quiet when you do not." He considered whether to dispute this and decided she was right. Cal and Dollars had put down deep roots in Calverton by this time. Cal's 12 acres had become 25 with a neighboring purchase, and he had built a real cattle operation, modest but solid, with Robert, now 18 and a serious, capable young man, working it alongside him. Maria, 15, had her mother's dark beauty and her father's easy sociability, and was keeping company with a young man from one of the surrounding ranches with a circumspectness that suggested a real attachment beneath the propriety. James, 13, had decided he wanted to be a doctor and had attached himself to Dr. Purcell with the focused determination of someone who had made a decision and was not going to be dissuaded. Dr. Purcell, now in his 60s, thought James showed genuine aptitude and had begun lending him books and letting him observe during the less consequential consultations, and had written a letter to the medical college in Galveston making inquiries, a letter that James knew about and kept folded in the front of his copy of Gray's Anatomy, with a reverence that he would have been embarrassed to have anyone comment on. On a Sunday in October of 1892, the extended Slater family gathered at Amos and Hester's house for their usual Sunday dinner. The porch had been expanded the previous year and could now hold all of them at once, which was useful because the evenings had been beautiful that October, with the hill country in its autumn color and the air cool enough to be comfortable but not cold. There were 11 of them around the table, and the noise level was what it always was, which was considerable, and the food was what it always was, which was excellent because Hester and Dolers had collaborated on it. After dinner, when the children had dispersed to their various occupations, Thomas and James down to the creek, Clara and Maria in the sitting room reading, Robert on the porch in conversation with Eddie Rios, who had come by for the latter part of the evening, Cal and Amos sat in the chairs at the end of the porch with their coffee and the evening hill going purple in the distance. "You remember what I said," Cal said, after a comfortable silence. "You have said many things over the years," Amos said. "Which particular one?" "In San Marcos, after Thomas was born, I said I had never seen you look like a man fully arrived in his own life." "I remember." Cal looked at his brother for a moment. "You look more like that every time I see you," he said. "I just wanted to say so." Amos looked at his brother. Cal was 40 years old and had the look of a man who had worked hard and been rewarded for it, content in the specific way of someone who had chosen the right things. "So do you," Amos said. Cal nodded. They drank their coffee and watched the hill go from purple to dark. Inside the house, through the open door, they could hear Hester's voice and Dolers' voice in the kitchen, overlapping and warm, and Clara laughing at something Maria was reading to her, and the general inhabited sound of a house that was full and lived in and unquestionably a home. The photograph hung on the wall inside, small and faded in its oak frame, the young woman at the edge of her father's yard with the wind in her hair, preserved at 19 years old in the amber of an August afternoon in Laredo in 1869. Some evenings Hester stood in front of it for a moment before she turned the lamp down, just a second's pause, and Amos had noticed this and had never asked her about it because he understood that it was private, a small reckoning between her present self and that girl who had not known how any of it would unfold, who had stood at the edge of her father's property and blinked back tears with everything ahead of her unsettled. He understood it because he had his own version of it, his own private reckoning with the man who had ridden out of Laredo in the spring of 1869, and then ridden in every other direction for 10 years before finally riding into the right town on the right August evening and sitting down at the right table. 2 towns over. 8 years she had been in Calverton while he was riding the wrong roads. He had been in El Paso while she was here. He had been in Santa Fe while she was here. He had been in Abilene, Kansas, while she was in this house, in this kitchen, 2 towns over from anywhere he was looking. And then Parrish had needed water, and his stomach had needed supper, and he had tied his horse at the livery and walked to a hotel and sat down, and the kitchen door had opened. He never stopped being grateful for the ordinary mechanics of thirst and hunger that had finally brought him to the right place. Never stopped being grateful that he had not stopped looking. never stopped being slightly awed by the sheer geographic comedy of it. 10 years and a continent's worth of roads, and she had been 2 towns over the entire time. He thought about this sometimes in the workshop, his hands moving through their work while his mind moved through its own quieter occupation, and he thought he had been given a complete education in the difference between the value of persistence and the necessity of luck, and that neither one was sufficient without the other, and that the correct response to having been given both at the same time was not pride but gratitude. In the winter of 1892, Hester told him over breakfast, with the same directness she always brought to important announcements, that they were going to have another child. Thomas looked up from his biscuit with bright interest. Clara, who was 5 and had been firmly informed the previous year about where babies came from in terms she had found deeply unsatisfactory, and had supplemented with her own theories ever since, said, "I knew it," with the air of someone whose intelligence had finally been vindicated. "You did not know it," Thomas said. "I did," Clara said. "Mama has been drinking chamomile tea, and she only does that when she is. That is a very observant conclusion," Hester said, simultaneously impressed and slightly alarmed. "But perhaps we do not need to share it at the table." "Rosa told me," Clara said. "She said her mother drinks chamomile tea when she is expecting." Hester looked at Amos. Amos looked at his biscuit. "Dr. Purcell," Hester said, resuming her breakfast, "will be informed this week in the appropriate professional manner." Their second son arrived in July of 1893, a summer baby, pink and warm, and initially more inclined toward sleeping than his predecessors had been, which everyone appreciated. They named him Henry William Slater Henry for no one in particular, because Hester had always liked the name, and William for Dr. Purcell, whose first name was William and who had attended the births of all 3 of the Slater children with a steadiness and competence that deserved acknowledgement. Dr. Purcell received the news of the naming with the dignity of a man who is moved but does not intend to show it, and was only betrayed by the fact that he went home and told Nora about it immediately. Thomas, at 9, was old enough to understand a new brother as a project, and approached Henry with the practical orientation of someone planning to teach him everything. Clara, at 5, received Henry with a combination of assessment and immediate fierce protectiveness that settled, within the first week, into an absolute certainty that she was corresponsible for him, which she expressed by informing anyone who came near Henry that he was her baby brother, and she knew how to hold him correctly. She did, in fact, know how to hold him correctly. Hester had taught her. The years went by in the way of years that are full and good, not without difficulty, because no years are but with the quality of things that are fundamentally sound beneath whatever weather they encounter. There were dry years, and a bad disease moving through the cattle that cost Cal a significant portion of his herd in 1894, which set him back considerably, though not unrecoverably. There was a fire that took part of Slater Woodworks in 1895, a lamp knocked over by an accident in the second workshop, and the second building was lost entirely before the town's bucket brigade got it under control, though thankfully no one was hurt, and the first building and all the tools were saved. They rebuilt through the autumn and winter of 1895, and the rebuilt workshop was better than what it had replaced, because Amos built it with everything he had learned about building well. Hester's school continued through all of it, growing steadily, and Rosa Rios was joined by a second teacher in 1894, a young woman from San Antonio who had heard about the school from the education office and had specifically requested a placement there. By 1896, the school had 60 students and had been cited by the county education office as a model for inclusive education in the region, which was the kind of official recognition that Hester received with a combination of genuine satisfaction and mild impatience at how long it had taken the relevant offices to notice something obvious. James Slater, Cal's youngest son, left for the medical college in Galveston in the fall of 1895, 18 years old, and carrying 3 letters of recommendation from Dr. Purcell, which were, Dr. Purcell said with characteristic dry understatement, the most honestly positive letters he had written in 40 years of medicine. Cal and Doler stood outside their house in Calverton, watching the stage take James south, with the expressions of parents releasing a child into the world who they are entirely confident in and slightly frightened for, which is the only honest expression for that occasion. Henry grew from a sleepy infant into a sunny, easy-tempered child, who was unlike both his siblings in his fundamental disposition toward taking things as they came, which his parents found both delightful and slightly mysterious. He followed Thomas's lead in the way of small brothers who worship bigger brothers, and followed Clara's instructions in everything else, which was how the household organized itself naturally, and he seemed entirely content with this arrangement. By 1897, Calverton had grown enough to have a proper bank and 2 new churches, and a weekly newspaper called the Calverton Courier, run by a young man named Delaney who had a journalist's insatiable appetite for the town's stories. He came to interview Hester about the school in the spring of 1897, a polite young man with a notebook and a quality of attentive hunger that Hester recognized as someone who would be good at his work. He asked her how the school had started, and she told him. He asked about the early difficulties, and she described them honestly. He asked if there was anything she would tell someone setting out to do something similar, and she said, "Begin before you are fully ready, because you will never be fully ready, and the people who need the thing you are building cannot wait for you to feel prepared." Delaney wrote it down and used it as the closing line of his piece, and it was the sentence that people in Calverton quoted to each other afterward when they were attempting something new and uncertain. Amos read the newspaper article at the breakfast table the morning it appeared, and when he finished it he looked up at Hester, who was feeding Henry and pretending she had not been watching him read it. "Well," he said. "He was a good interviewer," she said. "He listened." "Yes," Amos said, "but I was referring to you. I just answered his questions." "Hester," he said, putting the newspaper down, "you built something from nothing in this town that will be here long after both of us. You should know that clearly." She was quiet for a moment. Henry had finished eating and was now attempting to use the spoon independently, which was creating a mess that she was elected to manage. "I know it," she said finally, her voice steady but with a quality he recognized. "I know it, and I know something else." "What?" "I know that 10 years ago when you rode into this town on a horse named Parrish because the horse needed water," she said, "this is not the life you were expecting to find. You were expecting to apologize and explain and then figure out what came next." "More or less," he agreed. "And instead you got all of this," she said, gesturing at Henry, the kitchen, the house, the general overfull quality of the life they were in the middle of. "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the table, her gray eyes clear and steady and warm in the morning light that came through the kitchen window. "So did I," she said. It was a small sentence. It held everything. Henry, successfully wielding the spoon for the first time, looked up with an expression of pure triumph, and both his parents laughed. And the morning continued doing what mornings do in households that are full of life and people who have chosen each other, and the work of building something worth building. The photograph on the sitting room wall caught the morning light sometimes, in a particular slant of autumn or late spring when the angle was right, and it looked different in that light than it did in the lamp's glow, softer, more present somehow, as if the years had not moved away from it but gathered around it. A girl at the edge of her father's yard. A decade's worth of roads that led to a kitchen door. A man who could not stop looking, and a woman who could not stop believing he had had good reason not to come back, because she had always known him well enough to know he would not have left without one. They had been, when it came down to it, faithful to each other across 10 years and a continent's worth of wrong directions. Not in any formal way, they had made no formal promises. There had been no official keeping of faith between them. But in the deeper way, in the way of two people who have known each other clearly and have not been able to be dishonest about what that knowledge means. He had not been able to stop looking. She had not been able to stop thinking he had a reason. Both of them had simply been right about something that could not be proven until an August evening in 1882, when thirst and hunger brought a man to the right table. In the church cemetery in Calverton, Thomas Langston lay beneath a stone that Amos had carved himself, the year after the wedding, because it was a thing that needed doing and he had the skill to do it well. The stone said his name and his dates, and below that, because Hester had chosen the words, it said simply, he loved his daughter well in the way he knew. She understood and forgave him and was glad. She had stood at the grave after the stone was set and looked at it for a long time, and Amos had stood beside her with his hand in hers and had not said anything, because nothing needed to be said, and she had finally nodded once to herself in the way she had when she had reached a conclusion. "All right," she had said. "All right." And they had walked home in the late afternoon light. Back through the town they had made theirs, past the workshop and the school and the blacksmith's forge, where Gideon's hammer rang against metal in the cooling air, past the bench by the creek, where the whole long thread of this particular story had begun to pull itself into something coherent. Back to the house on the north end of town with its flower boxes, and its good porch and its 3 children, who were the most material evidence of all that two people who were faithful to each other across impossible distances eventually, in the end, arrive at the same place at the same time. Amos Slater had spent 10 years searching for someone he had lost. She had been 2 towns over the entire time. And everything else, every Sunday dinner and every schoolroom and every chair and table built in the good light of the workshop, and every morning conversation over coffee, and every child grown under the same roof, and every evening on the porch watching the light go off the eastern hill, had followed from a horse named Parrish being thirsty on an August afternoon in 1882, and from a man who had refused for a decade to accept that she was simply gone, and from a woman who had refused for a decade to accept that he had been anything less than faithful, and from the particular mercy of a universe that had not made it easy but had, eventually, made it possible. It was all of it sufficient. It was all of it more than sufficient. It was exactly what both of them would have chosen, given the choice, which is the truest thing that can be said about a life.